EMP Series, Day 168. Major Stillman walked into his office and closed the door. He had been summoned from the diner hastily by his clerk, a scared little man who was terrified of the Major and just about anyone else with authority. He told Major Stillman that he had a call on a secure line and that the caller said it was imperative that he speak with the Major immediately. He told him that the caller refused to identify himself, but told the clerk that if the Major wasn't on the phone in 3 minutes, that he was going to make the clerk wish that he'd never been born. Major Stillman wiped egg from his face with his napkin, stood up, grabbed his coffee, and marched at a brisk pace back to his office. He picked up the phone and announced himself. As he suspected, the call was from Congressman Ted Holmes. Congressman Holmes was a Democrat from northern Indiana. Mr. Holmes was not your typical Democrat in that he supported a strong military. He himself served in the Army during the Vietnam War. The F-4 Phantom that he was piloting was shot down over the jungles of North Vietnam in 1970, and he spent 3 years in the infamous Hanoi Hilton. Upon his return to the States, he was given a hero's welcome, and he milked the publicity from that into a career in politics, culminating in his winning the congressional seat in 1978, where he has served ever since. After running unopposed, his popularity was so great at one point he was widely believed to be unbeatable. He served on various committees during his tenure, and for the past 12 years, he has co-chaired the House Appropriations Committee. There, he has secured monies for various black ops and covert ops that don't exist anywhere on paper. He is a master at moving monies around in such a way that it virtually is untraceable. He jokes that he's the chairman of the Misappropriations Committee. Truth be told, he has become a very wealthy man in the process and has built for himself a fortune in weapons and resources, as well as amassed his own small army. He recruited a young second lieutenant, Stillman, years ago into his fold. Through manipulation and his vast-reaching influence, he was paramount in advancing Stillman's career along on a fast track and is solely responsible for making him the man he is today. Ted Holmes always had a talent for reading people very quickly. His specialty was finding young military officers with little or no sense of moral integrity, preferably ones who grew up in affluent families and were used to having whatever they wanted given to them without question. Someone who was spoiled rotten, living the life of a low-level military officer, was easy to manipulate. Ted Holmes had vast influence and resources at his disposal. He was a master at the game. By the time the young officers smartened up, Holmes already owned them. In Stillman's case, he took to the life instantly, and he spent his whole career serving Holmes with pleasure. He wanted all he could get from the military, and Congressman Ted Holmes was just the man to help him get it. Of course, it came at a cost for Stillman, a cost he was still paying the congressman every day. For Stillman, a self-serving, morally bankrupt individual, none of that mattered a bit. Theirs was a marriage made in fine cigars and expensive scotch, and both men used the other mutually to their own benefit. But there was no question who was the boss, and when Congressman Holmes called, Stillman came running. After all, Stillman was a man who detested hard work and had avoided doing it his whole life. Precisely why a career as a military officer held so much appeal for him. It was like welfare with hero status. Holmes knew this and exploited it to his favor for over 20 years. During Section 7's investigation of the military corruption circuit that led them to Stillman, there was a working theory that there was someone above Stillman in the ring. Carl was of the opinion that Stillman lacked the overall intelligence needed to run the corruption rackets to the extent and magnitude of what they had discovered them to be so far. Nunez basically agreed with Carl, but held hope that Stillman was the top of the chain. He did not like investigating the military, and secretly hoped that they could expose Stillman and move on to more significant matters directly. But deep inside, he knew Carl was most likely right. Neither one of them knew about Ted Holmes's involvement in the corruption. This would soon change. Greg and Steve rolled the power wagon up in front of the jail. They unloaded Lee and marched him into Carl's office. When they told Carl how they found Lee skulking about at the church property and his story about how he came to be in the region, Carl just paused and looked Lee over thoroughly. "So, what is the name of your hometown, which was looted and burned?" He asked this question as he pulled a sheet of paper from the tray on his desk, attempting to create the illusion that he had some master list issued to law enforcement of all the towns in the area that had been looted and burnt recently. Lee hesitated for only a second before answering. "Gilberton." Carl looked over the imaginary list and looked up suspiciously at Lee and responded, "Gilberton, you say?" Lee did not flinch or waver in any way. Carl, of course, had no such list, and was just trying to see if he could make Lee stumble or show himself to be nervous in any way. Carl placed the paper back in the tray and asked, "And you claim you fled this situation when exactly?" Lee quickly answered, 5 days ago. I left on foot on Sunday morning." Carl just stared intensely at Lee. What Carl could not have known was that Lee, previously having been an ATF agent, was skilled in the art of interrogation himself. He actually also worked in that capacity with the MC when it was necessary. He was steady and concise in his answers. He was almost certain that Carl knew nothing about the town he claimed to come from, and that the ruse with the supposed list was just that. Lee knew that no matter what Carl did or didn't know, his best move was to give short, confident, and concise answers to all questions. He knew that if he was caught, then he was caught, and there was little that he could do to change it. At this point, it was a game of wits, and Lee was no slouch and could hold his own with anyone. Carl was also a master of this game. However, he was approaching from a point of disadvantage because he had absolutely nothing solid on Lee. Nothing except an instinct, a gut feeling that there was more to his story than what he was sharing. Carl continued to question him for almost an hour. He went over the same details several times, trying to trip Lee up, with no success. He asked him about his time in the cell next to Hammer, and if the two men had spoken with one another. Lee kept the details of his story simple and short. He was staggering drunk when he was brought in, collapsed on his bunk and passed out. He woke the next day when he heard the deputy coming in with breakfast and was set free. He spoke to no one and did not even remember seeing anyone in the next cell. When Carl attempted to nail down the timeline, Lee just told him that he had absolutely no idea what time any of this took place, other than it was daylight outside when he left. Lee was cooperating fully with Carl, giving the impression that he genuinely wanted to help him find the truth, while at the same time telling him absolutely nothing. Carl brought him back and placed him in a cell, the cell that still had Hammer's blood stained on the floor. He told him he would have to hold on to him while he investigated. Lee knew that back in a time when there was law and order, Carl would be limited to how long he could hold him without formally charging him with a crime. All he could do now was wait. As Carl was leaving the cell area, he turned and looked at Lee and asked, "You ever own a motorcycle?" This caught Lee off guard. He wasn't expecting it. He hesitated for only a split second before answering, "A motorcycle? Well, yeah, a long time ago, when I was a lot younger." Carl turned and walked out without saying a word. Lee started to wonder if Carl had connected Hammer to Buddy Tanner. Could he have even identified Buddy's body this quickly? Then his mind started to go in all directions. He tried to remember if Buddy had any tattoos on his body that identified him as a club member. Then he thought of Roger. Then he put his hand up to his left breast, over the spot underneath his shirt that had his own tattoo permanently inked into it. It was a picture of an American bald eagle with the top rocker above that read TRMC, which stood for Tunnel Rats Motorcycle Club. The Tunnel Rat name came from the job that Buddy Tanner, a founding member, did in his service in the military in Vietnam. He was small physically, and it was his job to enter and clear tunnels used by the Viet Cong to move freely and quickly from point to point undetected. It was a dangerous job, and it took its psychological and emotional toll on the men who did it. In many ways, that job was the reason Buddy Tanner was the man he was when he returned from Southeast Asia. The bottom rocker underneath the tattoo said, "Brotherhood above all else." A life's credo that Lee and Roger had both betrayed. A life credo that Hammer died to defend. Lee remembered going with Roger when the two men got their identical tattoos. He knew also that other club members had gotten them too, but could not specifically remember seeing them on Hammer or Buddy. But the odds were good that one or both men had the same tattoo. Lee became concerned. It was very likely that Buddy had it, and equally as likely that Carl has seen it on his body during his murder investigation. But if Hammer had one, and Carl had seen it too, it would be evidence that the two men were connected. Then he relaxed slightly when he concluded that if Carl did in fact see it on Hammer or Roger, that he would have demanded to check Lee for it in an effort to prove or rule out his connection to the club. No matter what, he could not let Carl see that tattoo on him. He could not afford to allow Carl to connect him with the body found in the culvert, the body of Buddy Tanner. When Lee was a young ATF agent, all the guys that he served with were getting various tattoos. It was sort of a rite of passage to show their machismo and their gung-ho-ness for the job that they did. Lee always avoided getting one, never wanting to place a permanent marking on his body. In fact, years later when he broke down and decided to get a tattoo, the very first one he got was the one he got with his motorcycle club brother, Roger. The same one which now threatened to ruin his life.